Hi YouTube, this is Evie. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. This time I am going to be continuing my December series that is all about how to get involved in the real-life BDSM community. And before I go any further in this series, I did want to take some time and talk about and define some terms that I think are really important to know if you do actually want to go to events. So I am going to be dedicating this video to that. So if you want to learn more, please stick around. I'm going to be talking about munches and sloshes and what TNG means and all that stuff. So I am going to be doing some separate videos kind of talking about what it is actually like going to these kinds of events. This is going to be kind of more of a definitional video, but before you go ahead and watch those videos that I'm going to be making about what it's like going to Munches and what it's like going to parties and conventions and things like that, please watch this first so you actually know what I'm talking about and what I mean when I say these things. So the first term that I want to define is TNG. This is an abbreviation. It stands for the next generation. Think of it like Star Trek, the next generation. What this basically means is it's sort of like a modifier or a label. It can be applied to parties, it can be applied to events of any kind really, and it basically is a restriction on the ages that can attend. If you see something that is, say, like a TNG munch, that means that this munch is for an age range of people between 18 and 35, although it can vary a little bit. Usually, this does also include partners of people who are 18 to 35 but maybe older. So for example, let's say a 30-year-old is dating like a 37-year-old. That 37-year-old can attend a TNG event. Now, I really like TNG events, especially if you are younger and you're getting involved in the BDSM community, because you're going to find people that you may actually know in real life, like let's say people from your university or classes or maybe even your work. Not that necessarily a good thing to meet these people in real life, but at the very least, it is easier to meet people that are in your same peer group that have a similar level of experience and that have a similar outlook on life. At least when I go to TNG related events, I find it a lot easier to meet people and talk to people because I know that I am probably on a similar level and have similar relatable interests to these people. This is not to say that regular standard non-TNG events aren't worth it, but at least for me, if you're interested in more of the socializing aspect, going to a TNG party is going to be really helpful and really important, especially before you actually meet people and get to connect to the larger community. I've also found that TNG events tend to be more casual and more open to meeting new people. Again, this is not to say that non-TNG events aren't worth it or aren't as good as TNG events for people who are new to the BDSM community, but I just find that because of the age range, they are a lot more accepting of new people and they are more open to people who are into BDSM but maybe don't fit any of the traditional molds like an MS dynamic or leather that a lot of the older people in the BDSM community really value. Now, when I was talking about TNG, I mentioned a word, and I mentioned munch. But what is a munch? A munch is basically a meetup for kinky people in a non-kink setting. Generally, this is held at a restaurant or somewhere where people can get food. That's why it's called a munch. Because normally it's held while people are eating and communicating. It can also be in other places, like let's say like a coffee shop, but it is generally somewhere where people can eat food. Now, the reason for munches is it's just a really nice way to be able to meet people and meet your kinky friends outside of the dungeon and outside of a play party. Now, when you're at a play party, it can be hard to socialize because normally it's really loud or really crowded and busy, and having munches is a good way to meet up with people. Also, they are normally held during the week, so if you're the kind of person who is really busy on the weekends or has work on the weekends, you can't necessarily go to a lot of the play parties or other events that are normally held from like Friday to Sunday. You can probably make it to a munch that's held on a Tuesday or a Wednesday afternoon, and that is really awesome. And I think that munches are also a really great and casual way to meet people in the BDSM community because the emphasis of munches is not about play, it's not about meeting play parties, it's not about negotiation. It's literally just talking and meeting to people in the local community about topics that may or may not be kinky. So you can go to a munch and you can strike up somebody that is there with a conversation about, let's say, they're wearing a t-shirt that has Star Trek on it, and you can start a conversation about Star Trek or video games or whatever. There is a really wide variety of people that go to Munches, although a lot of them are themed. So while there are like overarching general Munches for just anybody that's in the community or interested in BDSM, there are also Munches that are just for, say, littles or pet players or people who are into knife play or rope tops or whatever. There are a lot of different kinds of Munches out there, and they can vary widely in size. In the community where I am from, they have like a smaller, like local weekly munch that's held within like a specific neighborhood of that city. And then once a month, they have like a really big munch that's held at a much larger location where everybody from all the neighborhoods in the city gets together and they have a big group discussion. With Munches, you do want to be careful. This is for geeky people meeting in a vanilla setting. So now is not the time to wear your fetish gear. It is not the time necessarily to speak at a loud volume where all of the vanilla people in the room can hear you talk about that awesome flogging that you had last night. Like, you have to be very aware of the setting that you're in. While you are around other kinky people, there are going to be topics of discussion that may or may not be appropriate. It's going to be kind of up to the location and how the people who run the munch want the munches to go. So before you kind of dive right in and talk about all of your kinky fantasies and all of the weird kinky things you did last weekend, make sure that's okay first. You can always just message people on FetLife if you want to have communication like that. Munches may or may not be the best place to do that. Now, related to munches are sloshes. They are very similar, although with munches, they tend to be all ages, and by all ages, I mean like 18 to, whatever, whereas sloshes are strictly 21 plus, because the idea of a slosh is that it is normally held at a bar or a distillery or somewhere where people drink alcohol. They are, in every other way, pretty much the same as munches. It is just a different setting. So it is a way for kinky people to meet in a vanilla or non-kinky setting and have casual conversation and meet up and talk about their lives and kind of just, be with people that have similar interests, even if they aren't necessarily talking about those interests while they're at that place. I personally really like sloshes. Like munches, they are usually held during the week, and they are also usually sort of either general and overarching, or they are meant for specific groups. With sloshes, they tend to be smaller groups rather than like a big, huge, giant mess of people like a munch can be, and they tend to be a lot easier to come and go because when you're at a bar, you can just get like one drink and maybe have a beer and then leave and that's it. Whereas if you're at a munch and you're at a restaurant and you order a meal, you're kind of stuck there until everybody else is done, or at least until you pay for your meal. So it's a lot easier to come and go with sloshes. Although one important note is that sloshes are a little bit harder to find than munches are. They're a little bit more rare. There are also a lot of other names that munches and sloshes go by, depending on what area of the country you live in, or what country you live in at all. So keep that in mind. These are just the terms that I'm using. There may or may not be other names for these kinds of meetups where you live. So the two biggest terms, and the two that are probably the most important to know about if you want to get involved in BDSM, would be play parties and dungeons. Now, the image of a dungeon that you probably have in your head is something like it's very dark and dank and mysterious and poorly lit, and there's people wearing gimp masks, screaming at the top of their lungs. And while you will find dungeons that are like that, not all dungeons are that way. It depends a lot on the community that you're a part of, what kind of kinks that you have, and just sort of what your community is like and what the building is like. I've been to dungeons that definitely fit that description, and I've been to dungeons that are really clean and well lit and look super modern. It's really just gonna vary depending on where you live and what you have access to. There are sort of two main varieties of dungeons and play parties I can think of. There's private house parties, and then there are organized center dungeons. A house party is sort of what is more traditional in BDSM and what is more common, because when the BDSM community was first getting started, there wasn't really any sort of centralized place where you could go and have a play party at a specific building where everybody would meet up. Instead, people would host parties with their own equipment in their own homes, usually for friends, although on FetLife a lot of times you will have public invitations with people who are RSVP'd, get the address emailed to them or sent to them in direct message or something like that. But it is sort of the more traditional way to go. Now, with house parties, it's actually a lot like any sort of house party you may have been to in college. They tend to be really jam-packed and cramped, and there's music going, and there's lots of energy. Now, at private play parties that people have in their homes. There also tends to be a lot of public sex, like more so than I would say in dungeons. But that is going to depend on what the host wants and what the host's expectations are like for play parties. Now, at house parties, you do have to be, at least in my mind, especially if you're new to the community, a bit more careful than you would be at a dungeon. And by that, I mean you need to make sure you really know who it is that you're playing with. You really need to make sure that this is going to be a safe environment for you. And you really need to do a lot of serious risk calculation, because when you're at a play party, they usually don't have the same level of monitoring, just because of the fact that it's in a house and it's in a private location, than you would at a public dungeon, just because of the fact that's how it's set up. It's a little bit harder. Now, when I say the word dungeon, what I think of is a public center that's in a building that is specifically meant to be used for BDSM play parties and education and as like a community gathering point. This is not somebody's private residence, whereas at like a play party, it's somebody's house for 6.5 days out of the week, and then for one evening it is a center for play and for BDSM and for public sex and things like that, with a public center, with a public dungeon. They are specifically meant to be used for BDSM. It's not somebody's private residence. Normally they are volunteer run and they rely on volunteer donations and the income that they make from parties in order to function. They tend to have a lot more equipment available at them and just a lot more events than you would say at a house party, because a lot of them actually run 6 or 7 days a week if it is a really busy community and they have a lot of demand for it. There are also dungeons that pop up at other events, so there are ones that maybe pop up only on the weekends, or they're held at bars like on Friday nights, like once a month or something like that. But the kind of dungeon that I think is not necessarily the most common, but is the most dungeony of the dungeons, like sort of what people picture are those kinds of public centers. Now, normally you do have to be a member to join these centers. Now, usually how it goes is it lets you have what's called like a taster pass, where you get to go to one class for free several times a month, maybe like once a week, a like sort of introductory class that is sort of meant to allow new people to explore the center and like learn the rules and all of that kind of thing. And that would be a really, really good time to go if you're new to the community, or even if you're just new to that particular dungeon, because that lets you see what they have, what their rules are like, what their expectations are, you know, all of that good stuff. It can be expensive to buy a membership, especially like, let's say you're a college student and having to pay $100 or $80 for a year-long membership to a community on top of, let's say, like 10 to 20 bucks for a party like once a week. That can really add up. What I would do is I would message that particular dungeon or that particular center to see if maybe they have some kind of payment plan available. In some cases, if you are really interested in getting involved in the community and you want to eventually become a leader in that community, they can offer you what's called like a learning scholarships. That way you can either get a discount on the fees to go to parties or just for the general admission and membership. Now, the last terms that I want to talk about would be fetish balls and conventions. Now, these aren't really super related, although a lot of conventions have fetish balls. A fetish ball, you can kind of think of like sort of like a really fancy like New Year's party, although sort of the fanciness of them can vary. For example, there is Sin City in Vancouver, and they hold a ball probably once to twice a month that is a themed event. Normally there is some kind of requirement that you wear a specific sort of fetish gear like latex or a leather outfit in order to get admission, or a costume that fits the theme of that particular ball. Normally, again, depending on where you live, drinking may be allowed and play may be allowed, but probably not at the same time. So they are not normally held necessarily at like the centers I was talking about, and they're not normally held at private parties. They're normally held at, let's say, like a bar or an event center that isn't necessarily always fetish themed, although for this specific fetish ball that they have maybe once or twice a month, or maybe less frequently than that, maybe a couple times a year, they are a dedicated fetish environment. And depending on the kind of community you live in, this may or may not be a good way to meet people. A lot of times at fetish balls, because they do tend to be more high protocol, which means they tend to be a lot more strict about what people are wearing and what people are doing, there can be kind of a barrier if you're new to that community to meet people, because in a lot of ways, fetish balls are less about meeting people and they're more about seeing and being seen, because a lot of fetish balls have prearranged scenes that are going to be happening, like let's say suspensions or something like that, that are done by professional performers. And if you're doing a scene, you're not necessarily doing it as a pick-up play with somebody you met at the bar. It tends to be something that's more prearranged. So if you're going to a fetish ball, not necessarily the best way to meet people, but it is a really good way to sort of observe the fetish community and all of its splendor, especially if you're somebody who really likes a lot of the decorum around BDSM and you like seeing latex outfits or you like seeing leather. Going to fetish balls is a really great way to do that. Now, my personal favorite of all the ways you can interact with the BDSM community is going to conventions. I love conventions. They are so awesome. They kind of combine everything about what I've talked about so far all in one. Normally, they are yearly events that happen around the same time. So, for example, like there's West Coast Bound, there's Kink Fest in Portland. There's some kind of, I'm gonna put it here if I remember what it's called, but there's some kind of like rope convention that happens in like Austin and New Orleans and like Minneapolis or somewhere at different times throughout the year. And basically they are weekend long events normally, let's say from like Friday to Sunday, that are normally held at a hotel, and they are a combination of classes and dungeons and meetups. There's usually also a vendors area. Sometimes there's like meet and greets and book signing for like really like famous BDSM book authors. Normally there are also meetings for like local like leather community chapters and things like that. But they are just so awesome because you get to do a little bit of everything. You can go to classes during the daytime, and then at night normally is when the dungeon opens. Now, at certain events, sometimes the dungeon is open from like 11 a.m. to like 1 a.m. or somewhere in there, but a lot of times at conventions they're open from like 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. or somewhere in that window. So what you do is you go to classes during the day. Normally there is a huge schedule, like just dozens and dozens of classes on everything from like introductory like impact play to like advanced blood play. Like there is a huge variety of classes you can take at these conventions. You usually get a discount if you stay at the hotel, and it's such a great way to meet people, and it's a great way to interact with a lot of just brilliant BDSM educators out there that you may or may not otherwise ever get to talk to or read their books or go to their websites or whatever. Like it is just, I am such a proponent of going to these conventions because a lot of times they offer very specific classes that you might not be able to take in your local community. Like let's say you're really interested in needle play, but your community doesn't have a single competent needle top. How are you going to learn about needle play if nobody else in your community knows how to do it? Go to a convention, because 9 times out of 10 there will be either a class related to that if it is something that allows for edge play at that particular location, or there will be an educator there who also knows about needle play and you can talk with them. There is also the possibility that you might be able to observe needle play or any kind of edge play that you might be interested in at the play party. The bad part about conventions would be the price tag. They do tend to be pretty expensive. Now, there are, again, like going to dungeons, ways to try and get them cheaper. If you know that you really, really want to go to this one convention and it's held in April, there's a pretty good chance they have a discount if you buy before a certain time. So let's say as soon as they announce the convention, the tickets go on sale and you get $30 off if you pay within the first month the tickets are available. And then that slowly goes down until you get to the actual day of the convention, and then it's like full price or whatever. There's also a chance that you may get a discount if you're a member of a local dungeon, because a lot of them have what's called like reciprocal memberships, where you get a discount off to go to these big conventions because they are so expensive. And then there's also the opportunity, again, for scholarships or grants to be able to go to these events. That may be a discount on your ticket, or maybe you just get free admission. And that's really everything I want to go over in this video today. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Feel free to leave any comments or questions you have down below. I am always happy to answer. As always, you can leave any video suggestions you have for me down below as well. And until I see you next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.